Hi, everyone. My name is Pete Scazzero. I want to welcome you today to the Emotionally Healthy Leader podcast. And our topic today is the key to unlock passionate mission in every member of your church or ministry. The key to unlock passionate mission in every member of your church or ministry. So Geri and I just finished a 2-week vacation in Ireland, and at the end of which we did a meet and greet with pastors and leaders, both in Northern Ireland in Belfast, and then in the Republic of Ireland in the south in Dublin. It was just fantastic. Learned so much. But we spent a couple of weeks prior to that traveling around the country and visiting just the wonderful people and so many sites around that country. But in particular, we visited a number of monastic sites that really give a great foundation to the history and the culture of Ireland, and especially Celtic Christian spirituality, which goes back to St. Patrick in the 5th century, and that great move of God, which changed the whole history of Ireland. Now, the last 2 weeks we spent on Elijah and the hidden power, or the power of a hidden life in God. And we talked about the cave as the heart and the center of all leadership. And out of that flows mission. And so, as Elijah stood at the mouth of the cave, we talked about how we, in a sense, have got to get to a cave or a cell or a place where the presence of God passes by and we hear him, out of which we then lead other people. And so Patrick offers us another whole angle of unlocking passionate mission, not simply for us, but as well as for those that we lead. And so about 21 years ago, I spent time in Northumbria, England, and north of England. There's a community there. And again, built on Celtic Christian spirituality, going back to Patrick, and learned a great deal, did a great deal of reading at that time. And so I used this trip as well to review and read a couple of books on Patrick. And it was just so rich, so wonderful that I want to dedicate part of this podcast to it. I think I believe it's got a wonderful gift for you today, as it's been for me. Now, the current condition, our current problem in the church is really twofold. One has to do with pastors and leaders, and the second has to do with the church as a whole. Barna, for example, has done a number of research studies on the state of pastors today, and basically have concluded, and this has been my observation as well, that most pastors are feeling overloaded and tired with little margin for themselves, too much to do in too little time. And between a bitter political climate, and that's put severe strain on the whole church, dwindling resources as a result of that, the immense stress of the role of being a pastor or leader in today's church, folks are feeling very isolated, pastors and leaders, lonely, and not enough time to cultivate their own personal well-being in God. And it's been said that 4 of 10 have considered leaving their jobs or roles as pastors over the last few years because of all of this stress and what's been called the burnout epidemic. And I like the summary quote which Barna gave, which is that we saw a steep drop in the number of pastors who said they felt energized by their jobs, and a large spike in pastors feeling discouraged, depleted, and defeated by their day-to-day work. So that's one challenge going on right now. The second is just the challenge of shallow discipleship in our churches, where people are being changed, but not very deeply. And I've heard this complaint for now decades. It's been going on for a very long time, a 1-inch spirituality in the Western church without great depth. So there's some wonderful lessons that we can learn from Patrick going back to 400 AD in Ireland. And he's been considered a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Lutheran Church, as well as the Church of Ireland for centuries. And a lot we can learn from him. I think of Jesus in Matthew 13:52, where he says, "Therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old." In other words, good leadership brings out new applications of the gospel, new treasures, but also brings out the old and makes them relevant for today. And so we've got a rich history of thousands of years behind us in Old Testament and church history that we can learn from and apply to our challenges in the 21st century. And so, as I'm going to give you a little history right now, a little background of Patrick, let me just commend to you a couple of books for those of you who are readers and interested. A bunch of my material here to simplify it comes out of George Hunter III's book called The Celtic Way of Evangelism. Very popular book, easy to read. A more heavier study would be Ian Bradley's Following the Celtic Way. Another one is J. Philip Newell's Listening to the Heartbeat of God. But now at around 400 AD, Patrick was growing up in Northeast England. He was one of the Celtic people. Celtic simply refers to tribes. Celtic tribes, they were in Western Europe, they were in Ireland, they were throughout the UK, England. And he's in the British Isles. He's from a pretty wealthy family. They've got servants. Rome at the time occupied England, but it did not occupy Ireland. And so what happens is some Celtic pirates from Ireland come into England, north of England, and they invade and they bring back thousands of slaves, one of which is Patrick. He's only 16 years old. And he gets captured, and then he's, for 6 years, is a slave there. He herds sheep. He spends a lot of time alone. But he's with a lot of other slaves, some of whom are Christians. Now, he was raised in a nominal Christian family, but he has a radical conversion in his slavehood. He meets God there in in the loneliness of being as a shepherd in nature, and learns to pray and be with God, etc. And he gets becomes a very devout Christian there in the wilderness with the sheep. And in his confessions, his book, he writes about how God speaks to him in a dream and says, "I've got a ship waiting for you at the coast to escape." And so he follows the dream from God. He goes to a ship and he escapes back to the British Isles, England. And he goes back to there, and he becomes a priest. He feels his call from God. And actually, at some point, we don't know the full details, he ends up learning from the monasteries in France, Martin of Tours, if you know the name. He doesn't become a monk, but he learns about monasticism while he's there. And so at some point, he has another dream. It's like the Macedonian call of Paul to go to Europe. And the call from him is to go to Ireland, his captors, and bring the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, Ireland had been very tough soil. They had not been very successful there in their mission. There were some Christians there at the time. They were considered barbarians. The Roman Catholic Church had not been successful in reaching Ireland. And so he gets ordained a bishop while in England, and he goes with the team to Ireland. He loves his captors. While he was there as a slave, he grew to love the Celts, the Irish Celts. And he goes back there with a team of people as a bishop, and he begins to bring the gospel. Now, what's interesting, he has a 30 to 40-year mission among the Irish Celts, and he launches a movement, a tremendous movement of God. They say he probably baptized thousands. He planted, they say, up to 700 churches, ordained about 1,000 priests, and of the 150 about Celtic tribes at the time, about 30 to 40, they say, became substantially Christian. And at his death, about 30, 40 years later, they folks follow him like Columba and Bridget and Aidan, and a couple of generations later, almost the whole of Ireland's become Christian. So it's a tremendous move of God. Now, he actually spoke against slavery, by the way, as well, and any forms of violence at the time. And so the Roman Catholic Church at the time, they had not been in Ireland. They're offended by his methodology, because he's spending all this time with these barbarian Celts, bringing them to Jesus, and these sinners, much like Jesus, and he's bringing them into leadership as well. And he's shaping a kind of a Celtic Christian spirituality that is different than the institutionalized Roman church. And again, he's a priest, and this tension of the two approaches actually culminates after his death in a synod at Whitby in 664 AD of the Roman Catholic kind of ways they were doing some things, from haircuts to celebrating Easter, and the Celtic Christianity and the Roman Church. Fascinating. But his approach was really a new kind of a church, less clergy-based, more community team-based. It was more Catholic and barbarian. He planted the gospel in Irish soil, barbarian soil. He contextualized the gospel, we would say, he did it really well. But what I loved about, I think, being in Ireland, seeing these monastic sites and realizing he had such a passion for mission. Matthew 28, God so, go make disciples of all nations, for God so loves the world that he gave his only son. And Patrick had that passion for mission. That's why I think so many, uh, evangelicals, charismatics, Pentecostals love Celtic Christian spirituality. Now, we're not talking about Celtic pagan spirituality. We're talking about Celtic Christian spirituality because of that great passion for mission. But what's really unique about Patrick, which so many people overlook, was he had learned from the monks in France, Martin of Tours probably, and Eastern monks about monasticism. Now, he didn't become a monk, but he learned from different types of monasteries, and then he kind of created his own monastic communities there in Ireland. And in fact, I visited a number of kind of these cells that they were in the form of like beehive stone, and but he was the way he adapted monasticism was so unique because one, he built these monastic communities not to protect against the world getting in, but rather to penetrate the pagan world. He put them in accessible places. Everything's islands there and boats, so he put them in places where there was lots of traffic. And the goal was not to protest against worldliness, but to build an alternative community and for teams to go out and plant churches. But it was out of a monastic community. And they built them to, again, to reach people for Christ. And they included priests and teachers and scholars, but also artisans and farmers and children as well as adults. In some of these communities, most were small, but some were quite large, up to 1,000, some say 3,000 people. More community approach of mission, less individualistic, and again, teams to multiply churches. And so again, the result was in 2 to 3 generations after Patrick, Ireland becomes substantially Christian. And he reaches not just Ireland, but Scotland and England and actually much of Western Europe after the Roman Empire disintegrates. And so again, there's multiple other applications of Patrick for us. I mean, there's so much richness, everything from the way he saw God's presence in nature and creation, much like, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the earth is his handiwork, or Psalm 104. His ability to contextualize the gospel to this Irish Celtic barbarian soil in fresh ways, his understanding of soul friends, aramkaras, that he called them, that you have a friend that you're vulnerable with and accountable to and you pray with to progress in the Christian faith. But I believe his great gift for us today is out of his deep love for the world and passion for the world, he creates these monastic communities for leaders to be anchored in Jesus deeply, out of which they're to go out. In other words, that we've got to become, as Christian leaders, cultivate a deep spirituality, and we've got to become free, completely surrender to the Father like Jesus was, and able to say, not my will, but your will be done. Lord, whatever you want, I'm game, I'm going for it. And so we get free from our disordered desires and ambitions and our excessive attachments, so that we're free to serve God and free to serve other people. That was the point of being part of one of these monastic communities. We want to be soaked in the love of God, filled with the Holy Spirit's power, overflowing with Jesus out of our inner life out into the world. And so we want to lead from a place of deep, loving union with Jesus, being with God and ourselves before we do for God and other people. And Patrick tapped into that and created a sense of community around that as they went out into the world. And so just imagine, the title of our podcast here is The Key to Unlock Passion in Every Member of Your Church. I mean, that's quite a vision. Imagine every person in your church passionate for mission because they have a walk with God, where I'm taking this now out of the emotionally healthy personal assessment, be before you do. Imagine this. Here's a few categories. I spend sufficient time alone with God to sustain my work for God. And so I can live out of a cup that overflows. Imagine every person being in a place like that in your church, and every person being able to say, it's easy for me to identify what's going on the inside of my life, what I'm feeling. And thirdly, when I'm anxious or I feel like I have too much to do in too little time, I stop and I slow down to be with God and myself to recenter. Or I set apart a 24-hour period each week to stop, rest, and delight. I take a Sabbath so that my work the rest of the week for God, whether in the workplace, is overflowing with Him. People close to me would describe me as non-defensive, content, peaceful, and free from the need for approval or disapproval from other people. And then finally, I regularly spend time in silence and solitude. And again, if you've never taken that assessment, am I an emotional infant, child, adolescent, or adult? Check it out at emotionallyhealthy.org/mature. That's emotionallyhealthy.org/mature. It's a great personal assessment. Takes about 15 minutes to do. Gives you a good sense of where you are and of course, our people that we lead. And the reason we created the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality course and the Emotionally Healthy Relationships course for churches, because we recognize we had to radically shift the way we live for Jesus. And that is, we've got to slow down our people that they're being with God and themselves, out of which they do for God. They develop their own deep spirituality, much like Patrick did, out of which we do mission in the world. And so that's why it took us decades to create that course, those two courses. And as you know, thousands are using that course around the world. And it's a great introduction to what Patrick was getting at here, what we want to get at. But it's an introduction to the kind of culture that we're going after. Because our vision, our mission at Discipleship is to revolutionize the church. The church needs a revolution. And revolutionize the church through two things: a emotional health and a slowed down spirituality. It's a completely new paradigm. It's a completely new culture, but it begins with us as pastors and leaders, as you influence other people. And so at Discipleship, we want to give you a taste, a new way of living and tasting this revolutionary way of leading for Jesus. And so, as you know, we've got things like we've been creating all kinds of materials for a very long time in Discipleship, things like this podcast. We have a school of emotionally healthy leadership for pastors and leaders. We've got all these books and resources on our website. So much of it's free to help leaders and like yourself begin to be before you do, to develop that kind of a deep spirituality out of which you do mission for God. But as I have been pondering and thinking about for well over 20 years, and seen the need for an even greater, a greater sense of community among pastors and leaders around the world who are engaged with us, almost like a monastic order. In other words, I've created actually a rule of life, and I have been piloting what we're calling an order of emotionally healthy leaders. It's a global community for pastors and leaders, and it has a rule of life to it. And so there's actually 7 of us pioneering it right now, and we're about to expand it. But I want to share a bit with you because I want to try to imagine yourself part of a community of other pastors and leaders, much like Patrick did in his day in the 5th century. That you're gathering around a like-mindedness that we're going to live out of a deep spirituality, a charism of emotional health, and a slow down spirituality. And we're going to mutually support each other as we go out into the world with a passion to see Jesus known by the world. Because you see, as goes the leader, so goes the church. That's why it always begins with us. And as the years have gone by, I've become increasingly more and more deeply convinced that as goes us, as the leadership, so goes the whole church and the movement of God. So here's what this rule of life looks like. And it's a slow down spirituality marked by unhurry and spaciousness. So it's got 4 categories: prayer, rest, relationships, and work. And I'll give you a few items under each category. There's 5 or 6 under prayer, rest, relationships, and work. But again, the theme is we've got a sense we're living a radical, deep spirituality as a leadership. And then we are able to give it to our people, who then get ignited for mission for God, out of which the kingdom of God goes forth. So it includes things like this. Under prayer, here's a few items. One, I take 5 to 20 minutes of silence and stillness before God every day. It's really like that Thomas Merton quote that argues, and I agree 100%, that solitude is not a luxury to be preserved, but it's a necessity. It's not for perfection. It's actually for survival. So we can live the life God has given us. And so silence and stillness is number one. We begin with that every day. Then we stop for the daily office 2 to 3 to 4 times a day, pausing to be with him. We practice Lectio Divina. We meditate on scripture 4 to 5 times a week. We practice Sabbaths on a weekly basis for a 24-hour period. We use Ignatian discernment. We're discerning daily the movements of the Spirit of God inside of us as we're living and making decisions. We read broadly to widen and expand ourself in God. Then under rest, we do things like, we practice weekly Sabbaths. We embrace our limits. We don't work 16-hour days. We enjoy times of sabbaticals and vacations along the way. We cultivate passions outside of work. We steward our physical bodies. And then we do relationships in a different way. We live as singles or marrieds as a sign and wonder pointing to God's love for the world. And so we get trained in being single or married. We treat other people as thous, not as its. We slow down to be present to people. So it's not just our pace that we adjust, it's our presence with people now. Where we internalize what we call relationship skills so that we can create healthy community, because the world is desperate for a healthy community. And so we want to be highly skilled at things like clarifying expectations and clean fighting, things that are part of the emotionally healthy relationships course. We cultivate meaningful relations with those outside of the church as well. And then work, we model discernment. We give space to listening to God before we make decisions. We embrace our limits before we say yes to new opportunities. We don't just simply take new opportunities. We're actually listening to God and what's he have for our ministry. And we've got enough space to lead and practice in our personal lives to lead our teams in that as well. We discern, we listen to God to discern endings and new beginnings as we're, again, leading our ministry, and et cetera, et cetera. But you get a sense. Imagine yourself free from disordered attachments in your heart and disordered or excessive attachments to other things, but you're actually freed and surrendered completely to the will of God, like Jesus in Gethsemane. Not my will, Lord, but your will be done. And so we're just free to serve other people. We're free to serve God. We're able to do discernment from a place of, Ignatius' term is indifferent. Like we're just open to whatever God wants, not simply what we think is best. And then we can lead our teams in that. Wow. And so we're just completely surrendered to God's will, and we're soaked in the love of God, empowered by the Holy Spirit. There is just no greater gift that you and me can give our people. There's just no greater gift. That's why this idea of Patrick, people forget, imagine he created these monastic communities all over Ireland as he's doing this mission, because he knew that unless that was in order, the leaders were in order first, the mission was not going to be sustainable long term. I like what Geri shared with me, my wife, the other day. She goes, Pete, the sower and the seed, as she was meditating on, she goes, it's not simply, there has to be good soil, the 4 soils. The seed has to be quality seed. Well, the quality seed is what we want to be sowing in people coming from our quality lives. I love that. And so our calling, we're seeking to do here at Emotionally Healthy Discipleship is, yes, we want to encourage churches to begin doing the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality course and the Emotionally Healthy Relationships course. It's a bomb going off in the church. It's an introduction to a radically new culture and new way of following Jesus, because it has depth to it. But that's just the introduction course churches. We're really about what we call them culture churches. That is the entire church and ministry being transformed by the kind of broad historical theology that we're about in Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. Every sphere of the church, children's, youth ministry, adult ministry, singles, marrieds, boards, the way we do mission, strategic development, team building, you name it. Everything is informed by it in the culture. But that begins with leadership. And now we've got churches moving into, we call them emotionally healthy culture churches. The leaders actually adopting the rule of life, of the order that I've talked about, the emotionally healthy order. That's radical. And we want to help provide support for you to live out that kind of a radical life for God, out of which you might lead your people into mission. Because if you've got that love and fire in you, it can't help but get into your people, because then you're going to lead them into the same progression of them being with God first, out of which they do for God. And that ignites fire, passion, and mission. And I've seen it over and over again. If we'll slow down, God's work will actually speed up, because it'll be his work through us and not us trying to strive to make it happen. So join us on this journey as we continue to take further steps and pioneer this, I'm calling it a pilot order of emotionally healthy leaders. It's a pilot. And join us as you begin on this journey with emotionally healthy discipleship. So it may be for you, your first steps are going to be, let me just check out this course, the emotional healthy spirituality and discipleship course for my own people. And so you can go to emotionallyhealthy.org/preview, and you can actually check out for free and a couple of sessions and get a feel of what this is about, because it is a different world or way of doing discipleship. That's emotionallyhealthy.org/preview. Or it may be good for you or to just begin to slow down your life. And this has been for decades now. If I was going to say one thing to start with to slow down, you say, oh, my life, Pete, I'm out of control. I'm going, in 10 directions at once. I've got way too much to do and too little time. I would say start with Sabbath. I've got a nice free ebook for you to download to begin to practice Sabbath, a 24-hour period each week to stop, rest, delight, and contemplate God. Just go to emotionallyhealthy.org/Sabbath. That's emotionallyhealthy.org/Sabbath. Listen, we're going to actually have a conference for the first time in 5 or 6 years, maybe longer, maybe 7 years, next October 1st and 2nd of 2025 here in New York City. Mark your calendar. Registration is not up yet. We have a save the page date on our website, but we want to invite you to come and join this growing global community committed to this kind of radical methodology that Patrick talks about, or Patrick models for us in the 5th century. Wow, it's a long time ago. The key to unlock passionate ministry in every member of your church, well, it begins with you. And as it gets in you, you can't help but give what you do possess, and you just can't help but it gets into your people. But if it's not in you, it can't get into our people out into the world. Blessings to you. I pray this day has been great to be with you. And I pray that the Lord would give you grace to be with him and yourself before you do for him and others. Blessings to you, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.